Helps if I add myself to the stream. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my first ever live stream for podcasting creation, if you will. I am, of course, the Podcast Mogul Phil Better. You guys are watching me live in the studio. I got my buddy Mickey with me. He's happy to be here, as you can tell. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is this podcast? What are we doing? And all that fun jazz. So here's what it is. I've been getting a lot of DMs recently from people asking, how do I promote my podcast? How do I launch a podcast? This and that, as I'm in multiple different podcast groups, as you should be as well, because it helps your show grow. There we go. Get a better angle there. So what we're doing is I'm going to show you how to launch a podcast from A to Z, automated so that it's easier for you to grow your podcast. So if you're interested or have any questions or comments, leave them down here. So before we start, I'm going to give you a bit of intro about who I am, what are we doing, and all that. So I am Phil Better. I am the Podcast Mogul. How did I come up with that name? You may be wondering, how does a man have a mogul in his title? Well, it started about maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. I watched the Fire Festival documentary on Netflix, and they mentioned that Ja Rule was a musical mogul. And I was like, I haven't heard him be a musical mogul in years, since the early 2000s. So I was like, you know what, if he can be a mogul for music, I can be a podcast mogul. And then through the power of manifestation, I became a podcast mogul. So this is a bit about a whole bunch of different things. This is actually 3 podcasts. I'm going to do 2 podcasts, but it turns into a 3rd podcast. You'll understand a bit later. So I've been in the podcasting world for the last 6 years. I produce and host 4 podcasts. They are the Phil Better Show, which was my first podcast, a movie review podcast that I host originally with my buddy DJ Overflow, aka Al, amazing guy on movies and music. And now I host it with my buddy Aaron, who is the pop culture expert, if you will, from his podcast, Aaron Talks Films. So we review movies every Saturday live on this channel, so you guys can tune into there. I also produce the Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur podcast, which was actually my go at learning how to be an entrepreneur. So again, I used it as a lead gen, and I got clients that way. And we'll talk about that more later on in the show. I also host Stock Dirty to Me, which is a podcast that goes live to 50,000 members of an investment group for beginners in the stock market, crypto, and all that. We talk about a lot of things. We go live every Wednesday at 5:30 or 7:30. I think it's 7:30. And we break down stocks each week. We put up a vote, people vote, and we discuss 3 different stocks. We break them down, why they're good, why they're not. Should you invest? Should you not invest? Again, this is just isn't financial advice. It's our opinions on it. And I, to be fully clear and transparent with you, I know zero about stock market other than buy low, sell high. That's pretty much all I know. But I've been learning a lot from the guys in the group and doing these live podcasts for the audience. So that's something you guys, if you're interested in, send me a DM. I will put the link to join, and you can fill out the questionnaire there. I also host Better Pain, a wrestling podcast with my good friend Taylor, the Mistress of Pain, which actually goes live every day, every Monday at 7, or every week at 7. Actually, not every day, because that would be weird. And we talk about wrestling. We talk about pro wrestling, independent wrestling, the WWE, AEW, stuff that is happening, local wrestling. So you can check out that every week. But I also produce about half a dozen podcasts that I don't host or anything like that. I do. Hold on, I'm just taking a look here. Here I got my first client, Lloyd Ross's podcast, Money Grows on Trees. I do A La Mood, which is a limited series for a intuitive eater therapist. I do the Scarfo Show, who's just a new client of mine. I do Talking with Experts for Chris Coden. I help him grow his podcast, get the guests and that for that. Trying to remember. Oh, and of course, Aaron Talks Films. I'm looking at my notes here. I have them all shorthanded, and I'm like, what does ATF stand for? I'm like, that's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. No, it's Aaron Talks Films, a good buddy of mine. He talks pop culture. I'm also a co-host and a producer on The Real Boys, which actually goes live tonight at 8, I believe, and every Friday as well. You can tune us. We review movies, our top 5 movies for the hosts on it, and then every Friday we do either a spin of the wheel or we do the latest movie that's coming out. Tonight's show is actually going to be about Breakfast Club. It is like the 3rd week we're trying. Internet life gets in the way, so there's that. And of course, I do the Chris Garfo show, which I mentioned already. Now, here's a bit more about why I'm doing this. I'm sweating like a beast, and I'm sorry. I just finished a workout. I'm doing this show because it's something that I think is needed now that podcasting is coming more popular. Apple just pointed out that there's 2 million podcasts already out there. And funny enough, only about 8% actually make it. So that's about 776,000 podcasts. Now you break them down into niche, it gets smaller and smaller, and so it's somewhat harder and harder. But with with more celebrities and businesses moving into the podcasting world, I thought it would be beneficial that newcomers learn how to grow their podcast properly, so that they can compete against people with money. Like I'm doing this bare bones, no money is being put into this. It's the equipment that I have. Obviously, it's the equipment I have, but I'll have an episode on equipment and that a little later. So this episode, it's the beginning episode. It's going to be a little convoluted, if you will, but we're going to be starting 2 podcasts. We're going to be writing out the script for this podcast, what's its title and all that, and why it's beneficial, the value. But also one of my clients, I got the permission from one of my clients, Brandon McClure, who actually hosts Fake Nerd podcast and the network of podcasts that's under the Fake Nerd company. He wants to create a podcast that will be for lead gen for his new company that he's creating, his new business, if you will, he's creating. So that's what we're going to do. These 2 podcasts are similar. Once you see the breakdown and the writing and all that, you'll see how similar they are, but they're completely different because we're using he's using Consultcast, which is the name of the other podcast that we're going to be doing live on the show, to use as a lead gen, so that you guys can look at and see, oh, maybe I can use this as a way to drum up business for using podcasts to drum up business for your company or your agency or whatever you do. Also, I'm going to be sharing my knowledge. I have 6 years of knowledge. I have access to a lot of amazing entrepreneurs and podcasters that are doing crazy stuff in the industry and building up this industry into its to where it can be equal to, if you will, of radio, television, movies, and all that. So we're working on that, and I'll be doing that. So that's what this podcast is about, the show that I'm doing live. It launches in 30 days. Both podcasts, I believe, will be launching in 30 days. So that is something that I'm super excited for you guys to see. So in 30 days from today, this will go live, and you guys can listen to it again, if you will. So that's what this show, Consultcast, like I said, it's for my client, and we're going to be generating leads for his business through that podcast. So I'll explain how we do that as well, because that's what I do with Invest in Yourself, the digital entrepreneur podcast. It's a lead generating podcast for myself, but also an educational for entrepreneurs. So it's a very interesting dynamic we have there. But also, just to let you know, in development here at the agency, the Phil Better podcast production agency, we actually have 4 other podcasts in development. So I didn't get permission from the clients to share who they are or why they're doing, not why they're doing it, but the background, creating the animation and all the automation, of the podcast. But I'll give you a little bit about it. I have a dating show that's in the works, or we're producing a dating show. It's more about learning how dating has changed in the digital age. So we're going to be having that. We have an automation expert podcast that's being created for a B2B business and how automation helps there. So that's going to be in the works as well. We have a musical podcast or a musician podcast that's talking to local musicians about their journey in being a musician in that. And then we have a sports podcast. It's very early. It's still in development. Not sure what the goal is for that podcast, but It's going to be around sports. If it's a particular sport, I'm not sure. We're still in the early development of discussing that. But that's what's going on at my agency, so that you know, clear and fewer. I actually have a notes on every day, what each day is going to be, and that. So you know, this is organized. It's not. Seat of my pants. Um, on this show, we're also going to try and get some guests, some experts in the fields that we're going to be talking about. So there's chatbots, email lists, cold outreach, guest getting, social media management, using ads, how to build a Facebook group as well, LinkedIn experts, podcast reach. We're going to be doing anything you guys have questions about. That's going to be showing up on this. And we'll see if we can make this a top 10 podcast. Who knows? Hopefully, with your help and my genius, we'll be able to do that. But now we're going to start off doing what I like to do, the podcast pitch. And so I'm just going to share my screen for a second. Over here. There we go. So I think there we go. This is much better. So as you can see, this is my general outline. Whenever I start with a client new to the company, new to the agency, we start with this podcast pitch template. The date is to be determined. So let's look here. 30 days from today. So 4 weeks, 1, 2, 3. For August 9th, we're looking to launch. So here we go. August. Also, I don't know how to spell, so if you see spelling mistakes, just don't worry. Now, we're going over to the overview of this podcast. So this is the podcast series, what we're doing. We don't have a name for it. We'll be coming up with a name. That's tomorrow. So we want to do 2 to 3 lines discussing what is the topic of this podcast. So podcast is to help beginners learn how to properly launch and grow their podcast. Now, the reason why you want to do that, that is your core reason for podcasting. This is strictly what is the purpose of the podcast? The purpose of each one of my podcasts that I have. So we'll go with the Phil Better Show. The Phil Better Show is just to share my love of movies with an audience and keeping them up to date. So sometimes people don't have time to watch a movie. They're like, is this movie any good? Should I listen to it? Also, they like my voice. So that's the reason why I do that. Plus, they get a dose of news. So that's what the Phil Better Show is for. Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, the podcast that I'm really happy with. I'm happy with all my podcasts, but this one is the one that's created the most growth for myself. Is a lead generating podcast while teaching people how to grow their business. So I have a bunch of different entrepreneurs on, and we discuss their podcast, either their podcast if they have a podcast, or their business, how they got started in business, some of the ups and downs in business, and we have a great conversation. So that's what Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, is about. Better Pain is just about wrestling. It's just we talk wrestling, we talk the most recent shows, we discuss different things like that. So if you're interested in wrestling, you check that. Talk Dirty to Me, as I said, it's a podcast to help you learn about proper investing. So whether or not you're a newbie, an expert, or anything, there's something you can learn from there. And then you have, is that the 4? Wait, I have one more. What's the other podcast I host? Oh, Better Pain. Yeah. Okay, that's all. I apologize. Sometimes there's this podcast as well. What's the point of this podcast? It's to help beginners learn how to properly grow and start their podcast. So that's being from anybody who has no idea how to do a podcast to already podcasters that want to help grow and learn. So that's the first thing. The next line is the podcast is to help beginners learn how to properly launch and grow their podcast, to connect with like-minded podcasters and share knowledge. Grammarly is something great, and I should and share their knowledge on podcasting. Simple as that. There you go. That is done. you already know what the podcast is about. That's your core value, and you can always re-examine that later on if you do seasonal episodes or seasonal shows. Now we go down to the goals. What is the goal? So who does this podcast bring value to? Beginners and amateur podcasters. That's who it brings value to, because I'm sharing knowledge with other people and to help grow them. What is the value? The value is my expertise, my knowledge, my expertise and knowledge. Now, for other people, if we're using Better Pain, the value is that you get a quick recap of what's going on in the wrestling world. Who does it bring value to? Wrestling fans. Where's the value? In listening to someone else do all the work for you. You know, how does it bring value? It brings value because it makes your life simpler. And then who benefits from the value? Everyone benefits from this. So those are some of the goals. Like, what is your point of the podcast? How are you going to why should people listen to your podcast? Those are questions you should be asking yourself when you're doing a podcast pitch. Like, these are simple things you need to ask yourself when you're doing this to see if you're really passionate about it. Because a podcast you need to be passionate about the subject. Like, if we look at Lloyd's podcast, Money Grows on Trees, he's passionate about helping people plant money trees. Now, we've always been told that you can't plant money trees. Money doesn't grow on trees. However, this guy has learned how to grow his money tree. So he has multiple streams of income. Instead of calling them streams of income, he calls them money trees, because he plants them, he works on them, they grow, and then he just uses the fruit to plant a new one. And he grows a second tree and a third tree. And now he's done this, and now he has $1 million invested in his portfolio, probably more. Last time I talked to him, he has a book that helps you do it. He has a podcast that does it. He has another course that he's launching. He is planting trees to create wealth. So he's creating products that create wealth, and each part of it that he does adds more. And you can see the successes that he has on his group, the Side Hustle Secrets, I believe is the name of the group. But you can always find more. Just search Lloyd J. Ross and or Money Grows on Trees. There you go, and you can learn how to start planting your money trees. That is what you want to do, is like, what is the point and what are you bringing? It's not about you, it's what you're giving your audience. And you always have to remember, your audience is the people who are in charge of your show. You just provide content, and if they're not great content, the audience won't enjoy it and won't follow it. So remember, your job is to provide some sort of value to someone. Why should someone listen to your podcast? Well, the reason you have to listen to this podcast is if you want to grow a podcast, this is the podcast for you, in essence, because I've done it multiple times. Now, we're going to skip the other two things. We're going to go out podcast layout. Now, your podcast layout is something that I should have brought a towel. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to get a towel because wiping my face is ridiculous. There we go. Get this in here. Oops. There we go. So I can hear myself and make sure the levels are perfect. The podcast levels. What's the length of the podcast? This is going to be about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. So you put that there, 45 minutes to 60 minutes. What's the style of podcast? So I've discovered that there's like 4 types of podcasts. You have the solo podcast, which currently this is a solo podcast. You have a co-hosted podcast. You have the panel podcast, and then you have the interactive podcast. So a solo podcast, obviously, you're either being a share of knowledge, like I'm doing right now, that Lloyd does. You're either interviewing someone and sharing their knowledge, which is Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, as well as Talking with Experts by Chris Cowden. Those both podcasts are solo podcasts, but with guests. So you're sharing knowledge with people. And this one will eventually become one similar to that. And also you have the Thought Leader podcast, where you where you try and be a thought leader. You share your thoughts about manifestation or other things. That's what a solo podcast really does, is sharing, is becoming, branding you as a thought leader. You have the co-hosted one where you usually have a co-host like Phil Better show, Better Pain, where you guys bounce ideas off of each other. Could be asking questions, could be knowledge, anything like that. It's more of a fun interactive. A great podcast to look at is the Weekly Planet. That is a great co-hosted. You see the energy and the fun that the podcasters have, and yeah, that is what a co-hosted podcast is. It's you and a friend talking about something, remembering always your audience. The panel podcast, it's a little more difficult to run. If you want an example of that, it's The Real Boys is a great panel podcast. We're 8 podcasters all together, and we discuss movies. But you can have a panel podcast with different guests. I've been on trivia shows in the past. That is a panel style where it's you versus, you have a host and it's like a game show. So a game show is kind of like a panel show. There's lots of panel shows on TV. Britain has like thousands of them, so you can always check out those to see what, like, how to manage a panel podcast. It's similar to that. And then the last one is the interactive. So this is theoretically an interactive. The audience can post comments. I can react to them. The stock dirty to me is really an interactive podcast because we interact with the audience all the time because they have questions and we share it up on the screen. So those are the types of podcasts you can have. This podcast is going to be more of a solo podcast with the occasional guest. Who is the host? Who are the hosts? Me. So you put Phil Better. And how often are they going to be released? They're going to be released weekly. The episodes. Right now it's daily because I'm doing a challenge. I'm doing a 30-day challenge of doing weekly podcast episodes, but once a week. And then when are the episodes released? Now that's a decision you have to make. Do you want to be on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? It doesn't really matter what day you launch your podcast, as long as you're consistent on that day. So I'm going to choose Tuesday. No, Monday. I don't have a podcast that drops every Monday. So Monday is this podcast will drop. So every Monday, the podcast will drop in the month of August. Now we go down to the episode layout. You go, how long is this? So we need to change this. It's going 45 to 60 minutes. So in this, you want to have it. Do you have multiple segments? You can put as many segments as you want. This is how we're going to break it down. The first segment is your intro. So I'll show you that. What's the intro? List what happens in this part. Then you go to the main part of the episode. Usually what we're doing right now, we're in the main part of the episode, the segment, the outro, and then you wrap up with a tease. So the intro lists what's going to happen. So in this episode, I already explained to you what's happening, but generally every episode is going to be intro of host. Then it's intro of the topic, and then a tease. Okay, you want to add the tease. The reason you add the tease in there, that's what we would like to call an open loop. You want to have open loops in your episode when you're doing when you're promoting your episode, because it gives the people who are listening some sort of reason to continue listening. So since we're technically still in the intro, even though we're 24 minutes into it, the tease for this is at the end of the episode, I'm going to give you guys a chance to win a free consult with me. There you go. So you have to listen to the end to see how you can win that. You can see them on a lot of video YouTube channels. They do a little open-ended hooks. You can do that with, hey, this episode we're talking with this guy, and you won't believe what will happen when I ask this question of our guest. That's something you can do as an open hook too in your intro. I always suggest usually the intro to be recorded afterwards if you're doing an interview podcast, because then you what you're talking about with the guest, and it can benefit you the most. Doing the intro pre kind of leaves it kind of like you don't have those hooks. So you don't know what to promote in the episode. So I usually do my intro and my outro after the episode. That's specifically for Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. Other podcasts, it's your choice, but that's how I do it. The main segment of this And the reason I say 5 minutes is because your intro and outro 5 minutes, that gives you 10 minutes, cuts down the time on the episode. So technically, it's only a 50-minute episode, but it's up to you how long you want to do it. I always suggest nothing more than 5 minutes for your intro. Now over here we have 30 to 45 minutes worth of, 50, 40 to 50. 40 to 50 minutes worth of it. And it's the main part. So you break down when you're scheduling your podcast, you need to know each week what is your each episode's going to be about so that people are aware and you're aware of. I've already done it in my notepad. I'll be doing this later off air because I don't want to leave away secrets of what's going. But this is mainly either it's your interview, it's the main part of your show that you're talking about, or it's broken down into segments. If you have different types of segments, you can do it like that. But it's the main portion of your show. The outro, that's the third segment of your show. You wrap up the episode. So you close the loops, you thank your audience for listening, and you tell them where you can find them, where you can find the podcast. This podcast right now, since it has no name, tomorrow we're actually going to be starting that part, the social media, so you can start following it right away. But really, that's where you wrap it up. You can say where your guest is from, where you can follow your guests, all that, where you can follow the show, any tidbits you want to leave there. That's what you leave in your outro. And then finally, the final part, it's like 60 seconds. You tease what's going on in the next episode. So I'm going to tease right now that tomorrow's episode already, because we're already coming into 30 minutes, which is amazing. Tomorrow's episode will be fully on designing your logo for your podcast, but also creating the social medias for the podcast. And then if we're going to jump into some groups of podcasting and get some questions, and we'll answer those so that you guys can know what it's like, answer and see my answers to those. Now, we can have some marketing in this podcast. We have marketing. So what's the point of a Facebook page? It's one, to allow your fans to find you, to share the podcast, and you can interact with your fans, and you create a community. And you can just other places for distributing and sponsors to reach out as well. And you can monetize the brand that way. That's what your Facebook page, your Facebook group, though, that is crazy. We're going to be creating a Facebook group for this. I'll tease a bit more about that later, but you create a community. This is where your fans can go to recognize each other and to grow, if you will. If you look at the Weekly Planet group, it is an amazing, healthy environment. Stock Dirty to me has a great group as well in the stock market for beginners group. It's a healthy place where you can learn and find ideas about stocks and stuff. So you want your Facebook group to be a place of community, and you want to build that slowly and surely so that you're better. Your podcast can become better. You create an alliance of people to show and grow your podcast. You have Twitter. Twitter's, I find, the main place to interact with your fans. It can be a cesspool if you're not careful. As long as you keep positive, you interact with your fans there. You can go on let them know about stuff that is happening. It's a little faster, I think, for quick ideas out there. That's what you want to do with Twitter. Again, it's a place to promote your podcast, so don't discount it. But I'll show you how to automate your Facebook and your Twitter. Instagram, it's a picture place. If you follow myself on Instagram at Podcaster Phil Better, you can see some behind the scenes of the shows that I produce, some behind the scenes of being a podcast mogul, as well as some tips and tricks to grow your podcast. So that's something you want to look for as well. And again, it's a place where your brand can be found. YouTube, that's where you're probably going to make most of your money if you're able to hit the 1,000 subscribers and the 4,000 hours of watch. But if you have 400 fans watching an hour worth and 400 videos, or 1,000 videos watching an hour worth, there you go, your 4,000. But it has to be done in 365 days, so 1 year's time. But you can do it. It's possible. A lot of podcasters have done it. Other people have done it as well. So it's always a good place to have your podcast on there, whether it's video like this, or it's just the audio with a picture, which I do for Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast. Reddit is a dangerous place if you don't know how to use it properly. You can make yourself a subreddit for your podcast, and it's like a Facebook group. It can grow that way. I haven't had much success on Reddit, but I haven't really delved deep into it. I'm a casual observer, but I've seen podcasters grow, and it's a place where you want to be, because if you're good with Reddit, you can grow your podcast, and you also can find either questions for your podcast, audience members for your podcast, guests for your podcast. We'll be touching on guesting later, how to use guesting to promote your podcast, but also how to get guests to promote your podcast and how to find the proper guests for you. Next is Patreon. Patreon is probably one of the ways. You also have Get a Coffee, I believe. I'm not sure. I do know that a couple of my previous guests on Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, use the alternate coffee, Get Me a Coffee, to grow their podcast. It's another place where your fans can pay you, or at least donate money to you. You can use PayPal, GoFundMe, anything like that. But Patreon, it's it's a little easier, I find, to use, and then you have tiers, so you can have different levels. I haven't looked at the coffee place yet, so I'm going to be doing that later. But we're going to be creating a Patreon for this as well, so you'll see how to create as a Patreon as well. Now, so this is just a regular podcast sheet that I use when I have my clients, when I'm creating their podcast. If you're interested in getting that, send me an email at phil@philbetterinc.com. Again, that is phil@philbetterinc.com. And I'll be more than happy to send you this so that you guys can use it to grow your podcast as well. So that's something I can share with you as well. Now, the second podcast where I was talking about is Consultcast. This is for my client, Brandon. He gave me permission to show you guys how we're going to create a lead generating podcast. Now, a lot of people know that podcasting is, oh, just share your ideas, or radio or whatever, but nobody really knows that it can actually be used to generate leads. I generate approximately at least one lead a month from my podcast, Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneur Podcast, and it helps me get paid anywhere between $1,000 to $5,000. That's what I do with my podcast agents. It depends on what the individual, the business needs, but generally that's what I'm producing from my podcast a month. Uh, Varies, but again, this is a side hustle that I do, so um, it's not my full time job. So this is how we're going to do the podcast lead gen for a podcast. So the Consultcast is actually going to be a podcast. Now, this is just really basically it's going to be about I believe it's again another 45 to 30 hour long show, where we have a podcaster come on, share their problem or issue, like if their sticking point, if you will. And then Brandon, because he's been in the industry just as long as I have and has grown multiple podcasts, uh, he will help you grow your podcast. He'll help you try and figure out the sticking point and take care of the sticking point and see if there's a solution for it by either previous guests that have been on, or of course his own knowledge. But the second half is even more what I love, is they're going to share a technique they like to use to grow their podcast. So not only is it a learning place to, if you have a sticking point that someone similar has, but also it's going to share with you how to grow your podcast in interesting and different ways, because each podcast has different ways of growing their podcast. So you may be able to find one. Like, my tips may not work for you, but they may work for someone else. Or you may have a tip and be like, yo, do it this way instead, which will help other people. That's why we need that communication, a constant conversation. So leave a comment, if you will, and you'll see someone answer it. Now, who does the podcast for podcasts to help grow their podcast? That's a lot of podcasts. Now, he's going to be running a consulting podcast consultant business on the side, and what that will do is this podcast can be used to generate leads and business for his podcast, because he can then send this off to other podcasters and say, hey, I answered that question on this episode with this guy here, give it a listen. Or he can be other podcasters can reach out and be like, hey, I would love for your help on this. Can you provide me with some help? And he can charge for that service. Or you can go to businesses. He already landed his first customer. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but this customer reached out to him to help create a new podcast, just like that. So already before this podcast is even launched, he's already getting business because he's so knowledgeable in his podcast. If you haven't listened, go listen to Fake Nerd, Fake Nerd News, or just Fake Nerd on YouTube or on Facebook or on any podcasting platform, and you'll be able to listen to his podcast. Now, answering the question, who does this bring value to? Podcasters. This is strictly a podcast for podcasters. What's the value? Is knowledge and expertise, as well as the guests. Is a guest bringing their knowledge and expertise to the world of podcasting. That allows you to see where everybody's going to grow, how you can grow in this and that. Where's the value? It's just in the knowledge. Again, like I said, how does it bring value? By sharing stories and actionable tips. Who benefits from the value? Podcasters. I'm going to benefit from it because I'm going to learn from other experts. Just like my client Chris Coden, his podcast Talking with Experts, he talks with a whole bunch of different experts. We're going to we'll go over here. We'll go to one of my sub accounts for him, Chris Coden. We're going to impersonate him and Talking with Experts. So we can look at some of the episodes that he has. He has a lot of episodes. As you can see, I was one of the episodes. Yes, I'm very happy. But he's talked with Jamar Johnson, who's the go-giver. He's a motivational speaker, performed in front of 20,000 people. So you can see that he talks with a whole bunch of different experts that are just dominating in their industry. So we're going to try and get some experts. I'm going to talk to you about how to get guests on when we get to there. So what's the length of the podcast? Like we said, it was about 60 minutes. The style of podcast, it's going to be a interview style. Is Brandon. Often our release, we haven't really discussed that, but I believe it's going to be weekly like his other podcasts, and unknown, to be determined. Also, the launch date, we don't know when to be determined. His intro, similar to this podcast, is going to be, introducing who we are, the guests, and giving a tease. Then we have the main intro. There's going to be two parts. We're going to have one part's going to be about 15 minutes. Each part's going to be 15 minutes, I believe. So you have segment 2. We're going to just copy this. We're going to go enter. Back. Segment. This is going to be segment 3. This is segment 4. So this is intro's 5 minutes. We know it's going to be 60 minutes long. So this can be 5, 10. So now we have 40 minutes long. So that's 20 minutes. 20 minutes. There we go. We go part 1. This is sticking points, as we want to name it. And this is the chair. So what is this? Guest shares their sticking point, and this is guest shares tips. And we wrap up the episode, major tease. There we go. So we've just completed 2 podcast pitches. You can be as detailed or at least detailed as you want. After this show, I'm going to be jumping off and doing the 4 other podcast pitches that I talked about. But just remember, you want to always bring value to, remember your value that you're bringing for your podcast. Why? What is your podcast? Why? I'm doing this podcast because I love sharing my knowledge. He's doing Consultcast because he wants to start a business. So he wants to become an entrepreneur, but he also wants to help the industry be better. So that's what is your why. Figure out your why, and it's going to be easier for you to do a podcast. If you're doing a podcast just to get rich, you'll burn out. It's not worth it. Look to bring value to people. The more you bring value to people, the more people are going to come to you. Like, this is why I'm doing this podcast. Yes, I may not get 100,000 downloads from this podcast, but I feel that I'm going to be sharing with you guys some very actionable tips and help you guys learn how to be a better podcaster. Because, hey, it's important to be a good podcaster if you want to survive in this thing. Something you all podcasters should know about is Chartable. It's this website. If you're an advertiser, you should be on this. If you're a podcaster, you need to understand it. So we're going to jump to how this works. Is you log in, you sign up, then you claim your podcast. So I've already claimed my podcast and the podcast that I manage. So we're going to jump over, but it's very simple. So let's look at my main podcast, Invest in Your Self. It pops up right here. You can go check anybody else's, but I'm going to go over here, and then it gives you a little bit. It tells you the review, the genres is in it. Request an update if you need, and it also tells you the ranking you are and all the ratings you get. I have 9 ratings. I have a 5.5 star rating. That's awesome. I love it. But you can also see everybody here and that in rankings. So we're going to go over to your dashboard. This is your dashboard. This is a very, very powerful tool. It lets you see the downloads you've gotten over the last 30 days. The reviews were down and the average review. This is for all the podcasts that I manage. And I also track some non-managed podcasts because I like to see what the other people are doing. This gives you your confirmed plays in Spotify for the different podcasts you manage. And then this gives you the multiple of downloads. So you can see in the last 30 days, Money Grows on Trees has gotten 1,567 downloads. That's in the last 30 days. His reach in the last 30 days is 620 people. So it also shows you the last 7 days of the podcasts that have come out, his downloads over time. This is if you're playing, you can see the reaction, charting at a glance. Now, this is the more important part. Last month. You can see where he's been ranking in United States, Canada. My favorite is Australia. So he's been this is where he's been ranking for education. But if we go to all-time high, he's been bouncing around. He dropped because new episodes, new people came in. He's at 15. But he's generally around the 10. For the last couple of weeks, he's been staying at number 9. So he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days at number 9, plus over here. So that's something to look into. You can always look at different. He's also in Chartable, Global, last month. He's rising. Chartable is a little harder because they're tracking over 2 million podcasts. So he's in the top 800. So there's that. So that's how you look at charts. This gives you all the charts of where they are, quick overview of it. So this is important if you don't have this, because it's genius, because it can tell you where you can focus your ad spending if you want to spend ads to promote your podcast. Because if you're already number 1 or 14th or 13th or whatever in a certain location, you can grow even more by putting money and ads there. So that's something you can do. But another benefit is it gives you smart links. Now, smart links can give you to specific podcast episodes or to specific podcasts. As you can see, I have a couple for my show, Money Grows on Trees, the Phil Better show. But it also, what's great about this is if someone clicks on it and they will go to a specific device. So what I mean by specific device is if we create a new one, new link, we go podcast, we go Phil Better show. You can link to an episode or to a specific podcast. You can name it what you want, and you can put here. It's optional, but you don't have to. Then you go landing page. Where do you want them? But you also can customize these options when you pay. So specific locations and that. So if someone clicks on that link, Let's copy this link. Copy. I'm going to paste it here. There. It brings me straight to Apple. But I can also edit it. If we go back to overview, I can edit this. Where's the edit? There we go. Edit. And I go to next and I can say, you know what? I want it to be only, I go edit. I go, yeah, you can do it only specific ones or whatever you want. I can hide this and I want to show only this. You have to link the destination, Google Podcast. There we go. So now we go next, we save. But you also can conditional redirects as well. So if someone's coming in from an iPod for an Apple device, it will go straight to iTunes. If it's an Android, it can go to Spotify or Google. You have those choices, and I would suggest you do it when you're doing it. You also have smart promos that you can get where you can, if you upgrade, your benchmarks, all these things are stuff you can do, and help grow your podcast to the next level. So that's why I suggest being on Chartable and having these done and ready. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is this episode. If you have questions, please leave it in the comments down below. I'll be more than happy to answer them on the next episode. Tomorrow, actually, we're going to be concentrating on, let me see here. We're going to create the logo for both ConsultCast and the podcast that we're doing here. So we're going to come up with a name. Right now, it's the podcast series. So that's what we're going with. But tomorrow is the logo. We're setting up the social media, and I'm going to be answering questions I find in podcast groups as well as podcast questions that I've been sent. So if you have anything, if you want to have a question answered, it could be anything from how do I monetize to what's the best way to get downloads. Like, ask away. I will share my knowledge with you. I am so thankful for doing this show. Thank you for everybody who's tuned in. I think we capped off at least 5 people. So, hey, I got 5 people watching my show. I am happy to do this for you guys. This is a pleasure and an honor. If you're interested in following any of my shows, go to, you know what? Just follow me on Instagram at Podcaster Phil Better. And from there, you guys can look and learn about everything else I do. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for being an audience and watching today. I am, of course, Phil Better, and I look forward to helping you grow your podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great day.